Okay, welcome everyone. I think I'll start the introductions because I see a kind of stable number of participants. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I co-chair this online seminar series, monthly seminar series on behalf of the ECPR standing group on the EU. Normally I do this with Nathalie Brack from ULB, who unfortunately can't be with us due to a glitch in her travel plans. At any rate, we're very happy to welcome Klaus Goetz, Leonce Röth, and Radu-Mihai Triculescu. Hopefully I've pronounced everyone's name correctly for this first seminar of 2024. They're going to speak on synchronization in multi-level systems, what it is, and why it matters. Klaus is the chair in political systems and European integration at the Department of Political Science at the University of Munich, Ludwig-Maximilian. I think it doesn't need much introduction. Let me just say that he's the long-standing editor of West European politics, and he's the PI of an ERC advanced grant on the topic that we're going to learn about today. And Leonce and Radu-Mihai are both postdocs at the University of Munich in this project. Leonce has worked previously on territorial politics, party competition, redistribution, and the interplay of ideologies and institutions. And Radu-Mihai has been studying the bureaucratic implementation of the EU's asylum policy at the national level. So I guess that he will be responsible for some of the core empirics. And we're very happy also to have as our discussant Virginie Guiraudon, who has been the chair of the sorry, this is asking me wants to switch my language to Spanish, which I don't think I want to let it. I won't let it do. At any rate, she has been the chair of the standing group on the EU, and she is also the co-organizer of this year's conference in Lisbon. She is the CNRS research director at the Sciences Po Center for European and Comparative Studies in Paris, and she's written very extensively on many aspects of European integration, but I would say especially migration and also gender policies. So the format is that Klaus and colleagues will talk for, let's say, up to 40 minutes. Then Virginie will comment for up to 10 minutes. I will say a few things myself or ask a few questions. I'll give the speakers a chance to respond briefly, and then we'll open up to Q&A with the audience. We should have plenty of time for that. And I see that we now have 27 participants, including us. So that's a nice round number, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. So Klaus, Leonce, Radu-Mihai, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the kind introduction. I should mention that in addition to the 3 members of the team, also there are 2 more members of the team here in the room. Paula Dornbusch, she's a PhD student on the project. She joined us in December 2023. And then Mina Bazi, who is also a PhD student on the project, and she joined us on the 1st of January this year. So the team is now more or less complete. We may be able to make one more appointment, but now we are ready to go. The first question I would like to ask is, how come we are here? So we got an invitation, from Jonathan and Natalie. We all got that a few months ago, saying, is anybody interested to present? We responded to it. We were given a date. And as soon as we'd been given the date, of course, we entered entirely voluntarily in this agreement. As soon as we got a date, that meant that we had to think about preparing an input in time. We could have decided last week to get out of this commitment and say, sorry, we didn't have time to prepare anything. After all, there was no formal sanctioning. But of course, we would have had to pay a considerable price in terms of professional loss of face, and people would have thought us rather unprofessional. We then, in turn, asked Virginie if she would be willing to be our discussant, and very kindly she agreed. Again, that meant that she, of course, expected to get at least slides a few days before. So again, we had to think about when to do that. So we had several dates with inputs. Virginie could have pulled out of this commitment. The seminar would probably still have taken place. The loss would not have been as dramatic because the event could have still taken place. But again, there would have been a loss of quality in the inputs provided to this event. And lastly, all those in the room, you've made time to do this. If you now had decided now, before I have so much to do today, I can't really attend, that would have been a shame. But the seminar itself would still have taken place and would have been at least the conditions in place for it to be successful. Now, why do I say this? Well, what we see here, or what we've seen, is a relatively simple form of synchronization. Somebody sets a date, other people more or less, in this case, more voluntarily enter into an agreement. But once you've entered into this agreement, even so there isn't formal sanctioning, it means that you have to try to stick to that agreement, and that you have to stick to that agreement over a longer period of time, trying to arrange your own time so that you can actually deliver the inputs to which you have committed. And that's precisely what this project is about, but in a much bigger setting, namely the European multi-level setting. And essentially, what the project is trying to do is to answer two questions. The first question is, how can you, in a complex multi-level policy system like the European Union, how can you ensure the timeliness of the inputs into what are complex policy-making processes, which sometimes take not just weeks, but months or even years? How do you make sure that those who do need to make an input, make that input in a timely order which allows the process to continue? And secondly, how do you make sure that that commitment, which is initially entered, actually sticks, when perhaps the people who initially entered the commitment, a national government or national ministry, changes, when the government changes in composition, when a new minister might come in, or when you have a change in the European Commission or in the European Parliament. So you have in European multi-level settings a basic challenge: ordering, temporal ordering over time, and commitment over time. The likelihood of time clashes, or what we call here temporal gridlock, is in principle relatively high in such a system. And it's even higher when you keep three things in mind. First of all, different policy challenges have a different temporality. Some things seem to be very urgent, others less urgent. Some problems suddenly appear and have to be dealt with immediately. Some problems take longer to evolve and also cannot be solved or addressed in a short time span. So you have a high degree of difference in the temporality of the policies. Secondly, different institutions operate under different time rules. This goes, for example, for national parliaments. We've seen it at the time of COVID. In some parliaments, it is possible to accelerate decision-making legislation up to the point where you can get a whole law through within 1 day. In other parliaments, that is simply not possible. So you have in the European system, if you look at the EU institutions, if you look at the national governmental and parliamentary institutions, different time rules, which impose certain constraints on the actors in the multi-level system, but of course also create distinct opportunities for some which are simply not available to others. And thirdly, in politics, we very often have different temporal preferences. Some want to act very fast. Some say, hang on, let's take time, let's slow down, let's deliberate, let's get more information. Now, temporal preferences don't just really relate to the urgency and speed, but it is often central to it. And that's why Leonce will talk in a few minutes about how we can actually measure temporal preferences and how we can measure, in particular, empirically, to what extent different actors feel under time pressure when they act. So that is part of the empirical core of what this project will be trying to do. Now, there are two ways in which you can try to minimize the likelihood of temporal gridlock, time clashes and temporal gridlock. One basic strategy is temporal delinking, or what we call temporal delinking, and the other is synchronization. The project focuses on synchronization, but I think it is important to acknowledge at the outset that there is also temporal delinking, and that in a sense, the two are partly alternative strategies, but also partly strategies which are used in parallel. Now, most people who study the European Union will be familiar or are familiar with strategies of temporal delinking, even though you might not have thought about it in those terms. And that delinking essentially has two dimensions. On the one hand, a more political dimension. Here, essentially, we're talking about strategies that try to depoliticize issues and remove them from the electoral cycle, and also the electoral cycle at the European level and at the national level. And secondly, what you might call substantive delinking. This relates, in a sense, to policies that you try to delink different public policies from each other, and perhaps even individual issues, as much as possible, so you don't have to synchronize so much. And if you look at the four-square matrix that you have in front of you, most of these strategies will be familiar with you. One, of course, is a recourse to non-majoritarian institutions. You will remember that Mazzone stressed, in particular, the quality of non-majoritarian institutions, the intention to delink the work of these institutions from the electoral cycle. That was one of the core parts of his argument. And very often when you talk about non-majoritarian institutions, this is seen as one of their main functional qualities. If you think of political delinking in a more procedural ways, looking at various strategies for depoliticizing public policy making, we call that here shielding the process as much as possible from political interference, and thereby also the electoral cycle. If you look at the more substantive aspects of delinking, i.e. separating policy domains and perhaps even separating individual policy issues, you're all familiar with policy silos and siloization as a strategy for insulating particular policy domains or particular subdomains. And finally, procedurally, we are aware of many ways of decoupling different processes, making sure, in a sense, that what we have, what Fritz Scharf called some decades ago, negative coordination rather than positive coordination in public policy making, and that helps to temporally delink. But what we are focusing on is synchronization. Now, what is synchronization? It's taken us quite a long time to come up with what is a very short definition of it, and hopefully we'll get some feedback on that because we will be working with this for another 4 to 4.5 years, so we better get it right. Synchronization we define as a deliberate time-centered ordering of inputs into policy processes. So deliberate, time-centered ordering of inputs. Those inputs can be financial input, a vote, it can be the provision of information, but there needs to be some input into the process beyond mere participation, beyond mere presence in a meeting. And by time-centered, we mean inputs which focus in particular on timing, sequence, frequency, speed, and duration of actions. When are we going to act? In what sequence are we going to act? How often, for example, will we have meetings? What is the speed of our deliberations? And what is the duration of the actions? So we have a basic definition, and like good scientists we are aware that most concepts are multidimensional. This one certainly is. So we've gone in search of the key dimensions. What are the key dimensions of synchronization? Again, what you have in front of you, and that's why we are so grateful that we can present at a still relatively early stage of our project, is our current thinking on the key dimensions of synchronization. And we come up with 6 dimensions, each of which is then divided into 2 subdimensions. The first relates to the extension of synchronization. Here we look on the one hand on the breadth. Are we talking about a process which tries to synchronize around a single issue, where perhaps you have a one-off decision? Or are we talking about synchronization when it comes, for example, to multi-annual 3 or 4 year processes of putting together a policy, a whole policy package, like in migration, we will talk about that, or Radu will talk about that in a few minutes. So breadth is important. Secondly, depth is important. And by this, I don't just mean that we are looking at a multi-level system. Rather, the question is whether the thing to be synchronized requires action, not just, say, at the European level with an input from a national government, but whether the process that you're trying to regulate requires parallel action, say, at the level of a regional government, a national government, and at the European level. Think, for example, of the EU's 2050 strategy in the environment, which explicitly envisages action both at the European level and complementary action at the national level. Second dimension relates to the actors. It makes a difference whether you coordinate and synchronize between 2 people or 2 organizations, or whether, as is often the case in the European setting, you are looking at several dozen members. That makes a difference. It is likely that as a number grows, also the range of opinions that need to be synchronized increases. And of course, there is a certain likelihood that also you have a greater variance in the preferences of the actors when it comes to synchronization. What is also important when you look at the actor constellation is the stability. Are we essentially talking about an actor constellation which is stable, where more or less the same actors meet over and over again and therefore develop some routines? Or are we again talking about a one-off get-together, maybe a more or less informal form of synchronization, which then, as it were, disintegrates once a particular issue has been dealt with? We need to look at the instrumentation. What kind of instruments are used for synchronization? That relates in the first instance to the repertoire. Are we talking about just one instrument, a timetable or a schedule? Or are we employing a whole broad repertoire of synchronization instruments which can be used in order to achieve this temporal ordering? And how precise are these instruments? Sometimes, like today, this is a very precise instrument which our chairs used. They said we start at 4 and we finish at 5:30. But very often when you find synchronization, you may find a formulation as soon as possible. Or if you think of, for example, accession negotiations, you have a relatively clear sequence that relates to the opening and the closing of the chapters. But the dates by which chapters are closed are not usually specified. It is kept open. The fourth dimension which matters is organization in synchronization. Are we talking about a high degree of formalization of the organization which is used, or are we essentially looking at things which are done on an informal basis? And what is the degree of specialization? Are we looking perhaps at organizations which have a specific synchronization brief, which are essentially time setters and timekeepers, makers of the clock and keepers of the clock? Or is synchronization embedded in a much broader organizational setting where synchronization is one task amongst many that the organization faces? Fifthly, we're looking at authority. Do the participants in synchronization enter voluntarily into this agreement, or is their participation coerced? And what about the bindingness of the agreement? Now, we entered into today's commitment entirely voluntarily, but once we entered, so it was voluntary rather than coerced, but once we entered, the commitment that we did make to the schedule has a degree for us of bindingness, because as I mentioned earlier, if we didn't produce something, there would be a considerable loss of professional reputation. And finally, what matters is compliance. Is synchronization closely monitored? So Jonathan and Natalie wrote to us a few days ago, reminding us what we had to do. So there was a degree of monitoring going on so that the input would actually be there. And as I mentioned, synchronization arrangements differ very much in the degree of sanctioning that is available. So what we do on the next slide is give you the range of variation that pretty much sets out our analytical framework with which we hope to capture essential dimensions of synchronization. Now, as I mentioned, one thing which matters very much is what is the perception of the actors when it comes to what kind of environment, temporal environment am I in? How much time do I have left? Radu just told me I have 1 minute left, so I better stop. So it's important. It's a time pressure. And that's precisely what Leonce will be talking about, namely the importance of time pressure in synchronization.
Yeah, first of all, welcome everybody from my side. I'm actually quite happy and glad to be synchronized into this. And as Klaus already said, he was talking about the importance and also about the meaning of synchronization. I take you a step back in order to talk about the starting condition or the time-related inputs for synchronization or any synchronization approaches. And Klaus was talking about 3 of them in the early part of the presentation. I quickly recall them here. So political issues have typically different temporalities. So for example, climate mitigation, health, energy, all these different policy issues have typically different temporalities, temporal characteristics. And then of course, as Klaus also said already, there are different time rules with political systems. So if you want to get something done, you basically have typically to adhere to the standard rules, to the standard clock of a political system, which basically means that there's a different amount of time needed in order to get something through. Then on top of this, to a certain extent, also anticipating these 2 elements already and then adding probably something ideological and something strategically on top, their temporal preferences. So different actors have different preferences about time-related things, which they basically put into the process of synchronization. And I'm going to argue that the perception of time pressure is actually a concept that incorporates not everything, but almost all of these time-related elements that basically are important for the starting conditions of synchronization approaches. And when we look at a regular or typical definition of time pressure, I think it's easy to see why this is the case. So the typical definition of time pressure is that it is an unfavorable ratio between the amount of time that is required to accomplish a task and the amount of time that is needed for a task. So I think this is obvious to the extent if you have to deliver something really soon, and you know it takes a lot of time to finish the task, that's basically creating time pressure for you. And if you have something which you can deliver like in the future somewhere, and you know it's super easy and quick to do, that is actually the opposite. You don't feel time pressure. And so in this definition on the perception of time pressure and how it works, we definitely have something like time rules anticipated because it relates to the needs, for the time needed to basically accomplish a task. And we have something like the perception of urgent something is like, which relates to the time required to accomplish a task. So I would further argue that if we look at the development in the political landscape, we see basically tendencies which move this ratio of the amount required to accomplish a task to the amount of time needed for a task in an even more unfavorable state. So we see on the one hand, if you think about the time required to respond, we see like tendencies of social and political acceleration. We see like in higher amount of or higher frequency of crises, which basically in some points leads to states of emergency, so on and so forth. So this is actually all tendencies which basically shorten the time required to respond politically. And at the same time, if you look at the other part of the ratio, we see that we have rising complexity of political systems, we have higher demands on inclusiveness, and we have probably also rising interdependence across issues or policy issues, which all basically lead to a situation where the time needed to respond are typically increasing. So you can see that if both parts of the ratio developing in this direction, we probably have to see the politicians these days are under very high time pressure. And this is, of course, mirrored in many accounts when we look at how scholars try to make sense of decision-making in the European Union. And we think of those working on emergency, for example, the work of Jonathan White or Christian Kreuzer-Sonn, or if you think about all these people working on crisis, all these people working on turbulence, polycrisis, so on and so forth. So in all these accounts, I think to a certain extent, sometimes more, sometimes less explicit, time pressure plays a very crucial role. And of course, it plays a crucial role also if you want to understand synchronization, because it makes a difference whether you're in a situation where you have very high time pressure and have to synchronize in comparison to a situation where you have no time pressure at all. So if we look at this and the crucial role of time pressure, it is important that at some point we come up with a measurement. So we need it for the project, and some part of the project is actually dedicated to address this lacuna. Because we want to basically sort different synchronization arrangements into time and space. And here I would like to go to the next slide. Because if we think about the example, for example, later when Radu will talk about migration policy, you will see that a lot of actors are involved, a lot of institutions are involved. It's developing over very long time periods. So in order to map the different perception of time pressure, we will not be able to basically just survey the people which were participating in these processes. And we probably also not will be able to basically measure it all qualitatively by hand coding, for example, because it would definitely extend our resources. So what we need is actually a scalable approach. So basically a method which is doing the job for us. And this is where we're aiming for in a two-step procedure. And we're going to take advantage of the availability of political communication or text as data, in particular in the case of the European Union, and also in the take advantage of the recent development in basically techniques to work with this data in order to classify when politicians invoke time pressure and when they do not. So what we did is starting to understand the language, because first, only when we understand the language of time pressure, we can basically do the right choices in terms of methods and how much resources to invest when, and what is an efficient way of basically classifying it. And for this, we basically took a random sample of Commission of Home Affairs speeches and basically started from a code book where we defined what time pressure is and tried to see, like, so we trained social scientists basically, and they were doing annotations. They did a great job and are basically looking at the text and say, okay, here we have an instance where politicians are invoking time pressure, and in this part of the text they don't. So we're studying these results first, and we were seeing that in principle, there are two different ways how you can invoke time pressure in principle. So the most explicit form, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide, is that you basically use a time-related word and also basically call for action. So you can either call for fast action or you can ask for slow action. So I give you two examples here on the slide from European commissioners. So they're saying something like, we need to put a policy in place very urgently. So this is a very obvious and explicit call for fast action, which is actually also shorthand for the fact that you acknowledge time pressure, because otherwise you wouldn't call for fast action. And then, of course, you can say things like, we will need to make efforts in the long term. So which means you have, again, a time word and you have something, a call for action, but you say, okay, there's time. We can wait. We can be slow about this. And then there are other parts of text or political communication where you invoke time pressure without both components. You don't even use time words and you don't even use calls for actions. But what you do is actually describing changes in social dynamics. And this is something I think at some point I started to think about it in daily life as well and did an experiment with my girlfriend, but this is something for the Q&A. So here, if we stick to the Home Affairs commissioners, we see that they say things like, Europe is facing the biggest refugee challenge. Or you find statements like, this is the hottest day since the beginning of measurement. Or you do something to say something like, numbers are going down already because of the policies we are putting into place. So these kind of descriptions of social dynamics basically raise invocations of time pressure indirectly by saying, so there is something going on which we have to respond to. And this is actually the majority of things. So you see these percentage numbers in the graph up there. So in roughly 66% of the cases, so politicians invoke perceptions of time pressure by talking about changing social dynamics, whereas in roughly 30%, they basically do it more explicitly by saying, really, we have to do something related to some like time keywords. This is something we'd have to take on board, and on this basis, basically, we moved on to think what kind of method would be the best in order to capture that validly. And as I said, we had this test case, and we basically went on with all Commission of Home Affairs speeches in the entire time period existent, basically. So it starts in '86 and it goes until today, basically. And on top of these annotations, we basically then started to meet and do some deliberation session. And this was done in order to ensure that we have a certain degree of reliability, because you all learned that we need reliability first in order to get at valid measurements. And so we wanted to see whether we can agree when we code the same speeches, we can agree on the instances where time pressure is invoked. And after the deliberation session, we were quite confident because we reached scores like 0.96, which is, I think, pretty good. So we can say there's a certain objectivity in the way we perceive time pressure in political communication, or at least in this application case. But we can do more with this, because we used these statements and basically studied the words, the keywords which were basically invoking time pressure, and then basically calculated something like values for discriminatory power. So we could see if these words are invoked, are they only invoked when time pressure is at stake, or are they also used in other contexts of political speech where they have nothing to do with time pressure? And that was actually the case. So the discriminatory power of these words, like urgently or like dramatic rise of asylum seekers, all these words are basically used in context where you meant to invoke time pressure, but also in many other contexts. So which for us were basically a hint for a decision that we cannot go with easy text classification choices. So we cannot go with dictionary approaches. We cannot use latent semantic scaling or even word embeddings, because we would basically classify a lot of instances which are actually not meant to rise the perception of time pressure, which technically we would call false positives. So I think the best models which are available and actually able to take this contextual meaning of words into consideration are transformers. So we typically know them by calling them artificial intelligence. And what's going on there is that basically we use on the token or word level all these annotations, and we train a big language model like GPT. In our case, we actually use BERT. And then we use another sample of the annotations to fine-tune the model. And then we use another sample which we haven't used for training and we haven't used for fine training in order to validate the model. And then this is actually the stage where we are in. We haven't yet the first validation results. But if we get results around, let's say, like 8 or 9 out of 10 classification tasks by the model are going well, or actually are precise and correct, then we basically can scale the model and say, okay, now we move on to parliamentary speeches of the European Parliament. Now we can go to the European Council. Of course, we have to do some more work to ensure that validity is also high in these instances where we go to other institutions and actors. But that would basically a success of a first test where we show that we are able to measure time pressure perceptions in political communication. So this is actually, to recall, it is actually important in order to understand and to map how time pressure develops over time, institutions and actors, in order to put synchronization approaches into perspectives. So we would know who's actually pushing for result, who's pushing for completion of the task, who's actually hesitant, so on and so forth. But of course, beyond that, I mean, it's easy to understand that if we have a valid measure of time pressure in political communication, it can be used on many other occasions too. And I leave that to your imagination to think about that. Would like to now pass on to Radu, because he's given you like a proper example of how synchronization is working in a pressing political, apply to pressing political problem, I would say.
Thank you, Leonce, for that beautiful segue into the topic that I'll be talking about. Thank you also to Klaus for the very elaborate definition of synchronization and what the concept of synchronization entails. And I want to do an illustration of how we can observe synchronization in practice and how we can observe it in a policy area, particularly one that has been known to be plagued by gridlock and by inability to actually move forward with proposed reforms. And thankfully here we have the European Commission, which beautifully put together a roadmap, which is a great illustration for what we would expect an illustration of a temporal dynamic to look like. So we have a roadmap with several deadlines and dates on there, with several milestones that needs to be reached for a comprehensive agreement to be achieved. And this really presents a great opportunity for us to understand how synchronization can help decision-making and policy-making in the European Union. If you see on this map, you'll see that two of those milestones are the Asylum Procedure Regulation and the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation. And these are two regulations that really address some of the most controversial issues of the European asylum system, namely the procedures that are used to determine asylum, and the Dublin regulation, which is used to determine which country is responsible for an asylum claim. And these are really two of the issues that negotiations generally get stuck in the mud on, and then two of the issues that generally stop negotiations and create gridlock. Yet, in June of this year, finally, 8 years after, or 7 years after the first reform was proposed, there was a preliminary deal reached in the Justice and Home Affairs Council. And while this was just a milestone, this was just a deal that was struck along the way to what should be eventually a bigger package deal, it presented to us a good opportunity to look at what synchronization can explain in terms of decision-making and policy-making. So using council presidency programs, using reports from the council presidencies, and using progress reports that were published as negotiations were ongoing, we were able to put together a preliminary illustration of what synchronization looks like. So what can we say that we observed through this analysis? We're first to know that we are dealing with a fairly constant actor constellation, which are placed within a certain degree of a hierarchical relationship. It is true that member states can change their leadership in the council formation, so you might have different ministers coming in, but those ministers coming into a very stable hierarchical relationship, or at least a relationship where they know the type of authority that they have. We also noticed that there is variation on two key dimensions of synchronization: on the extension, so from breadth to single measure or package deals, and on the organizational level, so formalized or specialized decision-making institutions. Most of the key elements that we looked through, however, and that we observed were fairly constant throughout time. Often in the media, especially nowadays, we hear about the European elections being a hard deadline that decision makers want to work on, that they want to get a deal by the elections, by the time the elections come around. However, this is nothing new. Every single European election cycle came with such motivations and call for actions. Even in 2019, we have several examples of presidencies calling for decisions to be made before the elections come around. So we cannot use these tools as an explanatory factor in the change in outcome. But of course, we do know that these are still relevant background conditions. So deadlines are used and are important, but by themselves, they do not explain much. With this analysis, what we really did then was foreground those two dimensions of synchronization that we saw variation on the, as I mentioned, organizational and extension dimension. And we observed that these variations happened in 3 distinct periods over time. So from 2015 to 2019, basically when reform was first proposed, then 2019, 2023, which is around the time that the pact was developed as it is known today, the Pact on Migration and Asylum. And finally, 2023, this year, or last year now, when the deal was actually struck in the Justice and Home Affairs Council. What we noticed on the organizational dimension is that the variation observed had to do with the kind of bodies that delegation was given to in the council. So initially in the first period, there was a delegation to preparatory bodies, but to the depoliticized ones. So Justice and Home Affairs counselors, for example, were the ones that were generally charged with assessing the legislative package. Whereas in the later time periods, period of time, we see that these delegations started going to the politicized Coreper bodies in the council. And there is actually several instances where we see in the progress reports that presidency acknowledged that without a political backing to decision-making and political backing to negotiations, an agreement will not be reached. Lastly, in 2023, we observed that also that the agenda is fairly restricted. So now instructions to Coreper tell them specifically what to look at and what not to look at, more particularly. So what items not to be added to the agenda so that they don't bog down negotiations. On the extension dimension, on the breadth, there is here the switch from a focus on single measure approach, incremental approaches that are agreed on in small issue areas. And hopefully the hope was that this would add up to a big package agreement. Whereas the major change that was in 2023 is that finally a package approach or a whole, let's say, full global approach to the deal was reached. In this case, we'll see that this was something that presidencies of the council realized that needed to be done because member states would not accept any other type of negotiation strategy. As I mentioned, deadlines were used throughout these periods, either electoral cycles, so whether European elections were happening or not, or also presidencies tried to advance packages as much as possible during their own term. So the term of a presidency was also used as a deadline. However, this did not change, and there was no variation that we could observe to explain specifically how a deal was reached. So several presidencies tried to adopt, as I mentioned, an approach where they kind of delinked issues and they tried to deal with issues incrementally, small steps, I would say, as agreed upon. And they generally did this out of belief that by agreeing on the small steps, this would lead to incremental approaches. This, however, we see throughout time that clashed with demands of member states, and member states always expressed a preference for a whole package approach without agreeing only on partial measures. So what the principle that was guiding member states' negotiation strategy was that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Eventually, the Swedish presidencies adopted this approach as well. They realized that this was needed to actually reach an agreement, and they coupled this with several other tools that they employed. So they used the use of deadlines, as I mentioned, the use of agenda management, which both sent hierarchically to Coreper. They sent measures for assessment and negotiation, but also restricted the issues that Coreper was allowed to look at. And lastly, they also used a joint roadmap that was signed between the council and the parliament to give more authority to the deadlines that they were imposing. So they used this joint roadmap as a way to enhance their own authority to set the agenda and set the deadline. This provides an explanation of how synchronization was used to overcome gridlock. It shows how certain aspects of synchronization, certain dimensions of synchronization can play out and how we can observe them, but is an illustration of just some dimension. So hopefully as the project progresses and we're able to develop the measuring that Leonce talked about earlier, we're able to start observing variation in more dimensions of synchronization, and we're able to move on to even bigger explanations of how synchronization affects policymaking. With that being said, we're happy to keep in touch with everyone that's interested in this work. And we're also looking forward, of course, to hearing the comments from our discussants today and from everyone in the audience. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. Very impressive synchronization and timekeeping of a complex presentation. So walking the talk, so to speak. And I'll now turn it over to Virginie as your discussant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this project. I really want to start by compliments. I mean, I know there are lots of ERCs out there, but what I like about this one is the theoretical ambition. Of course, that's then will be empirically applied, but I'll talk to that. And also, as I understand, you're looking at relevant policy areas where you presented a case study on immigration asylum, but of course, public health after COVID or is also interesting. And I'll speak a little bit about the theoretical ambition and how I see it. My main comments will go to how do you go from that to applying this to the EU context, and how do you make a case that time pressure synchronization matters? Based on the case study, I mean, you were extremely ambitious, including in your presentation. You talked about theory, methods, and a case study in 40 minutes. So this was, you know, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to speak to all of these aspects, but the first point I would like to make is indeed this question of time pressure, synchronization, the concepts that you mobilize. I think perhaps, and I mean, you did a beautiful presentation, especially Klaus, right, trying to say, so we have met because there was a deadline, but at the same time, I was thinking, is a time pressure a commitment already, an obligation? There are so many ways of conceptualizing it, but going back, I think what would be useful is for everyone to think of different the different ways that you think about it. One is time, by the way, if you're an historical institutionalist, is an obvious social science concept, right? I mean, if you're a physicist like Carlo Rovelli, of course, it's important, but I still think it would be nice to clarify for everyone time as you presented it as not subjective, but very objective. Every 6 months, there is a new presidency. Every 5 years, there is a new election. And you know, and there is nothing like clockwork like the European Union institutions. So this, I don't see what's subjective about this. This is, on the contrary, it's really clockwork. A bit like every month we have a seminar of the standing group, right? So it's so this already objective subjective would be would be interesting. Even I'll give you an example. One of my uncles was working for the Commissioner for Agriculture in the 80s when they had marathons. They were happy to say, we stayed up for 3 days, we did not sleep, and time was almost like a, you know, it showed like we really are going to stay up until we have an agreement on a common agricultural policy. So it would be nice to sort of distinguish a social science notion of time, but then when you go back, you know, but also a subjective versus a sort of agenda type notion of time. By agendas, of course, is a big agendas literature, which I think is relevant for you in the sense that there's media agendas, political agendas, but I think it would be nice to just to get us into the topic, to including the case study. What exactly you mean by that? Because when you look at the literature on time pressure and crisis, it's precisely what is outside the box, what is not on the agenda, what is not the regular expected schedule. So to give an example from the immigration and asylum borders issue that you mentioned, 2015, of course, it's expected, but still you can say, okay, it's crisis mode. The pact is something that was presented late, by the way, but into September 2020. And the deadline is the end of, is the election in June. Madame von der Leyen absolutely wants it done. And so it's something very, very much scheduled. So I think it's more, I mean, it's not a criticism, it's just a comment on how you present subjective, objective, and also these different notions of time. I also think at this point, I love variations and dimensions. It sounds very German to me. I mean, in social science terms, but maybe I'll have time to get back to that. But I think at this point, I mean, it's good that you're open, but it's unclear how the relationship between all this and this notion of synchronization and time pressure is still a little bit unclear. But in any case, yeah, the main point would be, yeah, time pressure, fine, subjective versus objective. 2015 versus 2023 is a time pressure. The measurement of it, methodologically, I understand that this point is from discourses from the Commission, but it would be nice to have this kind of different level in a way. So that's my first suggestion. The next challenge is indeed, how does it matter? And you take a big risk, of course, in saying, okay, I mean, a big risk in the sense that I understand the project is ongoing, so it's not as if you have final results. Is indeed, what is the added value of talking about this to understand why in December 2023, the Pact on Asylum and Migration was adopted. My suggestion here is to identify what would be the classic explanations on why the pact was adopted when you are an EU scholar and not involved in immigration and asylum. By then, and you mentioned it in your talk, I mean, this is just, at that point, the Parliament, by the way, has agreed to everything. There is indeed this election deadline, but, as you mentioned, this is in co-repair in this particular way, but so you have to tell us this is really, you have to convince us that this is not just regular classic interinstitutional politics or just agenda that's already set, and we can expect that of course there's going to be pressure to do something before the end of the mandate. You try to do it by saying, well, in the previous mandate nothing happened. But I think it would be good to sort of push on now, just to make the argument more convincing. The first thing, so what compared to classic policy making, interinstitutional functioning of the EU, what's the added value of talking about timing, sequencing, etc. The second point, which is also which happens to be my area, is what is specific to this particular case study? So what is this case study a case of? Very old question in comparative politics, right? So in the sense, and that forces you to look actually at alternative explanations, but it relates to your topic. In the end, you have to agree to something in December 2023, and you agree to anything. I mean, that pact, that the decisions that are taken, and you mentioned it in some of your dimensions and variations, so I don't forget that, but is that forget about implementation. I mean, you sign on something that will create actually more problems than it's supposed to solve, create huge, massive centers of where people will wait in Italy and Greece and elsewhere. So you decide something, and that's why I think the multi-level aspect of your project is crucial. Is yes, you can decide in December 2023 to sign off on some kind of strange system of how people arriving in Southern Europe will be then sorted out. And then we get back to time. Other people will deal with it. Ursula von der Leyen will not deal with it. The current EP, will not deal with it. So and it does relate to time. We're back to politics. Remember, people are elected for a certain number of years, or even nominated for a certain number of years. So the fact that the pact substantively is probably not easy to implement and will create more problems, it's the future people who will deal with it. So I think it's I mentioned that because I think it still relates to. So yes, we have a schedule. We absolutely need to sign that pact by December. Et après moi, le déluge, if I may speak French in an English-speaking seminar, is, they will deal with it. So I think that's, and which gets me back to this agenda issue, right? So there's this political agenda, bureaucratic agenda, but in the end, who will actually bear the consequences of this decision? For that particular case, I think it's relevant. I mean, it's not even an alternative explanation, because I could say, well, they signed blah blah blah, and that's my, and I have many explanations as an expert in immigration asylum why the sign was signed. But I'm on your side. I'm thinking, yes, there is something about time pressure that precisely explains the type of agreement which is hodgepodge, which is incoherent, which is. So I think you should make more of that. That is linked to the actual substance of what was agreed upon. Yeah, I've been long already. I don't want to. I have, of course, a lot of sort of detailed comments, including on all of these, as I say, already too complex things about variations and dimensions, and the fact it's a pact and not a single issue. But you had a simple case because it's all, you only look at the council co-repair, so it's not one of these very complex multi-issues. But I just want to end in a broader kind of comparative politics issue is, for me, I've been worked on this particular policy area for a long time, and I've been trained in comparative politics. It's interesting because you can see that the pact, what happens now, was probably decided in 1990 when they signed the Schengen Agreement. So as a social scientist, my explanation is an historical and institutionalist bureaucratic politics explanation. What was set into motion at that time has never been somehow reconsidered, reoriented. So that's the social science part of it. And then at the same time, there is 2015, this moment where indeed where this notion that, as you say, time, we have to decide, we have to decide very quickly, which does not get us very far. And then the pact is like this sort of midterm kind of, okay, we give ourselves a term, we give ourselves 5 years. The pact was presented in 2020, but it was already presented, by the way, by the, it's 3 years, but it's actually 5 years. It just took them a long time to get the text of the pact by the Commission. So I think, yeah, I would sort of push you to work on these different kind of time dimensions. I was, again, very, very intrigued and excited about the theoretical ambitions. Thank you, Jonathan. Sorry.
Before we open up to the audience, I just want to, in a way, pick up and amplify one of the points that Virginie made, and that is about implementation, really to ask you how implementation fits into your framework and into the envisaged work of the project. I would say that Klaus, when you presented, there were moments when I could see that implementation should logically be a part of the story, especially when you talk about the multi-level dimension of EU policymaking. But both the methodological discussion and the case are very much about decision making, and it's not obvious to me how the text analysis could be used for implementation. But I definitely think that in terms of the theoretical ambitions of the project and its applications to the EU, implementation is very important. And I will just make two illustrations. So I would say that one of the distinctive features of the EU or of EU policymaking is the extent to which temporal reporting, review, and potentially revision is built in to the structure of decision making. And I think much more so than in most comparable democratic polities. And I mean, there are many reasons why legislative gridlock is so predominant in the United States, but it is one way that the EU avoids that is by the requirement regularly to review and reconsider major pieces of legislation. And most of the time, not always, it does manage to revise very important framework pieces of legislation. So I think that needs to be part, if this is applied to the EU, the institutional feature needs to be brought into the picture. And the other point is in a way the one linked to the one that Virginie very specifically made, and that is that the conditions for synchronization of decision making can then create problems in the implementation phase. And this also has to do with the way synchronization and delinking are combined, as you suggested in your theoretical framework. So policy actors who are excluded in the decision-making process may turn out to be important in the implementation process. And if their perspectives are not considered, this can either lead to political opposition at the implementation stage, or it may be that the proposals themselves, because they don't incorporate the knowledge and perspectives of those often local actors, are less implementable. And just to give you an example of this, I've been studying myself the Next Generation EU Recovery and Resilience Facility and the National Resilience and Recovery Plans, which were adopted with immense time pressure. And we see more or less everywhere that these had centralizing effects on decision-making. There is variation between countries, but we now see implementation problems arising because of the exclusion of actors in the decision-making phase. And so the question would be, how are you going to incorporate this implementation dimension into your analysis? And I would also be interested for the case study to know how you think it's going to matter for the asylum migration pact. I mean, do you agree with Virginie that an agreement was needed, an agreement has been reached, but not necessarily an agreement which is workable or which resolves the central problems that have bedeviled this field? So let me give you a few minutes to respond to these comments, and let me meanwhile ask the audience to start lining up your own questions and comments. And given that we still have 28 people here on more than one screen, the best way to do this is to put up your virtual hand in the reaction icon on the bottom of your screen, and that will then move you to the top of my screen, and I will know that I need to call on you. Okay, so Klaus and colleagues, over to you.
Well, thank you very much both to Virginie and to Jonathan for your comments. And there is a lot I could say in particular on time, and I have said some of it already in earlier stages of my career. But let me get straight to perhaps the key question, or the biggest question, the challenging, what's the value added of focusing on time pressure and on synchronization? I think the value added to the understanding of policy making in a multi-level system is twofold. We have a lot of, or the standard explanation for decision making in the European Union is spatial. Basically thinking of the spatial distribution of people's or government or the European Commission's preferences, whether it's left or right, you somehow think of a space, a policy space, and you try to understand the positions of the different actors, you understand the resources that they have available, you try to understand some of the policy-making procedures, and thereby you're explaining the outcome. What we are doing is to say there is a second dimension, and that is the temporal distribution. It matters not just what you want, but it matters critically your perception of how urgently you need to act, or at least to have different temporal preferences, which, as we say, the term urgency does not capture all of it, but it captures quite a lot of it. And this is, in a sense, the standard argument which you find in the literature on crisis and on urgency and on emergency and on turbulence. But when it comes down to the actual empirical analysis, what these temporal preferences are is usually assumed. So we have a lot of writing about, what Europe did in the migration crisis or in the financial crisis, and people say that, actors perhaps use time pressure or invoke time pressure in order to get certain outcomes. But this is very rarely, or as far as we know, not really systematically studied. We assume that governments want to act fast and maybe that other actors want to slow down. So the first, as it were, I think, innovation is by making this distribution of perceptions, how urgent is something, how urgent is this problem, and then the preferences that come from that in terms of how do we need to act, and then how do we organize it, how do we synchronize the different inputs so that we can actually act fast. That's the first issue. And the second is then the temporal ordering of the actual process. So to sum that up, first, hope for innovation, foregrounding, and putting at the center stage the perceptions, the understanding of the actors, of the timescape in which they are acting, and second, the consequences that flow from that for how policy inputs are then ordered. This is what the project is really about. And when I wrote it, and I wrote it myself, well, there was input from one colleague, Nicole Bollaier. She gave me a lot of suggestions, but that is basically the argument which I made, why I think it's innovative and why it hopefully will tell us something about policymaking in the European Union, which many people perhaps, nobody would dispute that time is important and that sequence is important, but showing it in a systematic way is different. The first comment of Virginie is about what does time stand for here and what does synchronization mean. So basically the argument, and what has time pressure to do with it? Basically the argument is in any multi-level context with a large number of actors, you need to have more or less explicit synchronization in order to make sure that different inputs into a policy-making process arrive roughly on time and roughly in the sequence that you had initially intended. Sometimes that can be short and sometimes that can be long. Now, of course, there are European institutions which are very much about regularizing that and formalizing that to the largest possible extent, and Coreper 1 and Coreper 2 would, of course, be very good examples. And good institutions are primarily about making sure that you have a predictable way of dealing with a problem. So you're trying to fit problems into an existing structure. However, if you have a crisis, or what people perceive as a crisis, if you have an emergency, or what people perceive as an emergency, then the normal way in which these institutions work may be perceived as being too slow, too cumbersome. So you have the development maybe of you have calls for new synchronization arrangements, which allow you to order those inputs in a new way, maybe, for example, skipping certain sequences that you've had before, acting much faster than you did before, meeting at a much higher frequency than you did before. Or you say, well, these institutions simply don't do the trick. We need to set up a specific synchronization arrangements to deal with this problem urgently. So in response to you, Virginie, so the focus is on capturing this weird and wonderful world of synchronization along those 12 subdimensions which I mentioned. That is the key focus of what we're trying to do. And we're feeling our way into there, and we're looking for good cases of, and as you said, we're looking both at migration asylum policy and then at public health policy in the European multi-level system. So all of the problem solving that we will be actually publishing on will be multi-level. Time pressure is only one influence, we think, on synchronization arrangements, but it is something which many people have invoked as very important for policy making in the European Union, but we don't seem to have, at least we haven't come across, systematic research that actually would show you what different actors in the different institutions, not just in one institution, but in the different institutions, how they read the time pressure, and what kind of responses they therefore think are necessary. So I hope I've got at least that part, or these two questions, answered in the first very preliminary way. And maybe, Radu, you want to say something about implementation, because your thesis was on implementation, so you don't need any persuasion. In fact, we've had some arguments about what role, how far we want to go down in the implementation route. Radu actually went into individual offices in the Netherlands and where else?
Romania.
And in Romania.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's a question I'm happy to get. I won't take a lot of time on it, so we can also go to the audience in case there's any questions from there. But I think the advantage, especially with the migration asylum policy area, is that in the substance of the policy itself, we have a lot of temporal aspects. And it's very clear deadlines given for implementation guidance on how fast does this decision need to be made, how fast does registration have to happen, how long can you hold someone in detention. And we already have a lot of temporal aspects that need to be brought together into a policy area, into an implementation procedure. And that will give a great opportunity to look at how this synchronization can happen in this case. More so even that we have these European agencies like Frontex or the EUAA that also need to come in and provide guidance, help, and so forth. So the opportunity to look at synchronization both in national settings and how they relate to European settings, I think for asylum is, it's laid out for us. The matter you asked of how will we use this in our research, that hasn't, I don't think we've defined that yet. But it is something definitely that's at least on my radar. It's right at the top.
Okay, thank you. Can I see from the audience whether there are people who would like to ask a question? I do have one question which has been written out in the chat, which I'll read out, but can I see any show of hands, either physically or preferably virtually, if somebody wants to come in? So I don't actually see questions from the audience apart from the one that has been put in, which I'll read out. And
There is Thomas Chris Johnson has raised his hand.
Sorry, Thomas, I didn't see you. Okay, well, Thomas, why don't we take yours and then I'll take the question from the chat, which is quite long.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thanks very much, everyone, and especially to Klaus and the team for the presentation. It's I think obviously very, very interesting and important. And I would be surprised if you need more ammunition to convince people that time and time management matters. But indeed, the next step is the important one. You know, how does it matter and what effects does it have? I would maybe push you a bit more on the politics of it. I mean, a lot of it sounded quite technical and more, let's say, like public administration than political science. So maybe we can push a bit more on that. I mean, the distinction that I would make that I think is in there, but I didn't see it so explicitly, is between the time that cannot be helped, as it were, that is sort of imposed on us. I would consider that a structure. You know, there are certain things, you know, which arrive from the outside externally, but then also the time pressure that is created, one could say, artificially. And maybe that's a distinction between, well, that is not exactly the same as a distinction between politicization and depoliticization, but one could link it to that and say, to what extent are actors able to manipulate the time and the synchronization for particular political purposes, either to speed things up or to slow them down, or to what extent are they not able to do that because the structure is too strong for any individual actor to go against that. I mean, for me, that would be politically very, very relevant, because you could then take something, whether it's migration or climate change or war or whatever, and say, okay, here they are just using some sort of urgency in order to get a result, or on the other hand, they are denying the urgency in order to depoliticize something. So I was missing a bit the link between political agency on the one hand, and then these processes that you were talking about. And I mean, that matters for the big issues, but I think it also matters in the smaller arena. Like, as you know, I've worked on treaty reform, for example, you know, and simply to invent a deadline, you know, sometimes creates a result. You know, it creates a certain urgency, and it's now understood, I mean, I think among all the actors, that without a deadline, however artificial, you don't get a result necessarily. On the other hand, something like the European election or whatever is not an artificial deadline. That is there, and that is for real, and you may not like it. And that actually might imply also non-action, because that deadline is too big and too soon to get anything done, so let's rather leave it, you know. So that's maybe where I would push you a bit more on the actual politics and the political agency of it.
Before I let you respond, let me present the question, which I think is, with the assistance of Google, I can say seems to be from Alessia Damonte from the University of Milan. She says she has some mic issues, so here are her questions. On your framework and the dimensions of synchronization, could actors' heterogeneity be more fruitful and indicative than their numbers? And on instrumentation, do repertoires cover or are shaped by informal and formal policy and legal tools? On methods, as regards large language models, have you tried the Stanford parser for parts of speech classification? And on synchronization arrangements, could the garbage can model or the multiple streams framework be of some help? So with that, I'll turn it back to Klaus and colleagues, and you can respond to the big question Thomas raised, and the shall we say multiple questions that Alessia presented.
I think maybe we should. I want to give Leonce a chance to also join the conversation. And I'm certainly not able to answer the question about the Stanford approach. But Leonce, you seem to nod when Jonathan was talking. So maybe you can maybe come in on this question, and maybe also one of the others that was raised.
Yeah, I'm happy to join the discussion. So I would love to start with Thomas' question, actually, because like I'm coming from party politics, so I definitely, when I talk about time pressure and going into the measurements, so it's definitely something which we have on the radar, that this is like a contested issue. So it's not so easily visible when you look at the speeches of commissioners, because they have very specific role. But once you go to parliamentary speech, for example, if you go to political parties, you definitely see how contested the time pressure is across all the major dimensions of, let's say, migration, climate change, but also health, so on and so forth. And it's definitely worth probably going there. It's just a matter of prioritization within the project, whether we put it like on the center stage there or we make it somewhere else. But it's definitely something I think worth looking at. To the Stanford parser, yeah, I think I kind of answered it with a slide that all the approaches that typically try to work with specific words and try to weight these words, which are in essence all basically dictionaries. And say if these words occur, we basically make it a classification. I think it's tricky to use it in our constellation, as I said before, because of the contextuality of time pressure invocation. So I think we really need a more sophisticated way, which is large language models, because they are the best in really sorting out contexts in which words appear even more than word embeddings, for example. So I think it would not do a better job, but we actually plan to test different classifiers, because typically all the other ones are way easier to do. And then we can compare the results and the performance, and then you will see whether maybe it is even outperforming a bird language model.
Mm-hmm. Can I perhaps just add to what Leonce just said? So it's a multi-year project, and the nice thing about the ERC project is that you get funding for 5 years or even 5.5 years. So we're still pretty much in the early stages. The ambition is indeed, Thomas, to map the temporal understandings and preferences of not just the European institutions in those two policy domains, but also selected national institutions, whether it's government or parliament, so that we have a full understanding, first of all, of the dynamics. Are there periods when urgency, for example, which is what we're focusing on at the moment, is very much at the center of the debate? Are there other periods when that is not the case? Will we see perhaps that the Commission makes many more invocations to urgency than the European Parliament at the same time in the same domain? So that's precisely what we're trying to do. It takes quite a long time to get there. I'm always impatient. When we had a previous project with text analysis that I did with Ronnie Patz and Svanhildur Torvaldsdottir, I was also impatient. So I said, well, when are we finally there? But it will come. It takes time, as those people who are the experts on this know. It takes time to set this up. We have made, I think, considerable progress also in identifying already the corpora of texts that we will want to look at. So we have already a fairly clear understanding, once we are fully operational, as it were, what texts we want to look at, what is relevant in the different domains, in order to have, as it were, this mapping of the timescapes in which the different actors think they're operating. So that's one part. And then the second part is more the qualitative analysis of the synchronization, which we think will be influenced by these perceptions. They're not the only influences, of course. But what is precisely interesting is to see, in particular in the more institutionalized synchronization settings, will we see essentially a maintenance of routines? Will we see adherence to the deadlines? Will we see that the monitoring and the sanctioning works? Or will we see, as we all know, even when you have very clear synchronization arrangements, even when you have dense monitoring, even when you have strong sanctioning, well, a national government can just say, we're not playing ball. We're not attending this meeting. We're not providing the input which is necessary. So that's basically the idea. So it's quite ambitious, but we are at this early stage. So politics comes very much into it. But I agree with you, Thomas, the definition of synchronization, that is more in the public policy and the public admin literature. It is based on that. but understanding some of the key influences that shape the synchronization arrangements. I think there we're very much sensitive to political perceptions of different actors, but we want to understand them in a more systematic way than we do at the moment. But of course, Radu mentioned, I think, or at least showed at the end, we will have a workshop in Lüneburg in a few weeks' time, ECPR, on temporality. And some of the colleagues who have worked more qualitatively on emergency politics, for example, Jonathan White, he has agreed, I don't know whether he's in the room, but he has agreed to also come to the workshop. So we hope to get a conversation going amongst those people who are interested in the temporality of the European Union. What we hope to bring to the party is, on the one hand, the systematic analysis which works through texts. And we already have some ideas that maybe we may be able to go beyond time pressure and look at other things. And secondly, what we bring to the party, I think, is this focus on synchronization. Of course, other people have been interested in the temporality of policy processes. I mean, we're not the first of those. But to understand in particular how different inputs are organized and basically the instruments which are used for that, I think that will be hopefully an advance. So
well,
may I add a tiny little?
That, and I say it's 1729. So
may I add a tiny little bit to Thomas' comment, because there's no other hand visible? Is it possible?
yeah, sure. I mean, people
No, I just thought
gradually filtering out of the following their own time agenda.
I'm gonna be quick. I just wanted to reiterate on what you just said on the importance of the trying to distinguish between time pressure, which is basically structurally imposed, and time pressure, which is basically invoked strategically or ideologically by actors. And I think that's a super interesting question. And of course, it's at the core of the Jonathan White argument. There are recent attempts to kind of actually also measure that. I think there's a piece by Christian Rau in JEP who tried to distinguish. This is something I think we cannot do yet with our work, but that would be super nice if we would be able to like really measure and parcel out by language whether time pressure is invoked on the basis of structural condition or invoked on the basis of strategic consideration or even misused. But I think it's hard to get there, but there was definitely a thought which is worth following.
I mean, these are excellent answers, if I may say so, but I just wonder whether your reliance on textual analysis is sufficient to capture that, because one could also imagine that there are deals being done behind the scenes to define certain things as urgent or not that don't necessarily make it into the speeches that you analyze. So maybe a little more methodological variety might be good there.
There will be, Thomas. We've chosen this because initially in the application I'd also talked about a survey of the actors. But you can only do that if you have the survey really at the time when the decision made, because otherwise people simply won't recollect. So for the moment, we put that, to be honest, we put that on the back burner. Don't tell the ERC yet. But what we are doing is to complement this analysis by interviews, and we are starting to arrange interviews, hopefully in April or in May, around the deal that Radu talked about. So we will want to complement what we find from the text analysis. But the advantage of the text is that people usually talk at the time when they're actually experiencing it. So the perceptions which they have at that moment are critical for us. We need to capture that. And even if you do interviews, retrospectively, even 4 or 6 weeks later, people might suddenly have a very different recollection of what they felt at that time. So that's why we are doing this. And of course, also because all the institutions and the national institutions produce text, and they do so in more or less formalized settings. So there is a degree of comparability, there is a degree of continuity over time, same kind of text forms. Of course, it makes different whether you analyze a speech given in Parliament, or whether you analyze a formal announcement of a government. Each of those has a particular form that impacts on the content. So I've been persuaded, we've had discussions, I've been persuaded that analyzing different texts is probably the closest that we can get in a systematic way, to reconstructing, or to construct for ourselves, to understand reconstructing, to understand what the temporal perceptions and preferences of the actors are. But as I said, it will be useful to complement that by actually talking to people. It's always useful to talk to people, and it's certainly been very useful to talk to you this afternoon.
Yes, can I just say one thing on this? In what you presented today, the textual analysis mentions commissioners' speeches. And what we discussed is discussion in a co-repair, which is typically, so there has to be an alignment of methodology and ontology, as my old professor would say. So I think you're shooting yourself in the foot by saying, okay, we're going to look at commissioner speeches, and then you're discussing a case study where what's been happening is precisely in something where there is no text, because it's precisely so I don't know if that's where Thomas was going, but I think there has to be some coherence between these two.
I mean, I think it goes to show that both are relevant. And
I think it shows that ideally you need to complement.
Yeah, no, but it's just, I say, I'm on your side. It's not but it's the way, if you present things as we're using this textual analysis and then the case study is completely different. It's just the way, you have to there's a disjunct here that I think you can. I'm saying that because I know you're going to present in Lisbon and in other places.
By that time, we probably have something more debate. This was a synchronization problem, Virginie, because we not yet fully harmonized between the conceptual framework, the systematic observations, so the text analysis that we want to build up, and then the more qualitative analysis. You're absolutely right. It doesn't yet sort of fit fully together, but I think many of the hints we got today will help us in ironing that out over the next weeks and months. And as I said, we have a workshop where we present some of our own work in Lüneburg too, and the ECPR joint sessions. And by that time, I think we will be one step or two steps further ahead.
Okay, on that note, future-looking note, shall we say, I just want to thank the three of you, but also Virginie, for a very stimulating presentation and discussion.